If nobody's ever said that to you before, let me be the first. I believe you, and you should have lived a life without trauma, period. We all have that right.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. We have so many cool connections, some of which I don't love that we share, but it's reassuring to know that someone like you, someone who's like really powerful and has a voice, is out there fighting and being an advocate for survivors.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and right back at you. I love that you're using your magnificent platform to get some of this info out.
Well, the way that we got to meet is interesting. I was trying to find a firm that could help represent this group of women, and our cases were complicated and varied and not clear cut. The firm that you work with is highly recommended, and in fact, one of the things that had me like most excited to meet with your firm is just knowing that you were there. So for those people that don't know your story, do you mind sharing with us a little bit about what it is you do today and the irony of, your purpose?
Yes, it's such a full circle moment for me. The irony of my story is that I am a lawyer representing survivors of sexual abuse in civil cases. And I was also once upon a time a plaintiff in a case against former USA Gymnastics team doctor, Larry Nassar.
Gives me chills every time you say that.
It's a name that still to this day, it's hard for me to reconcile the fact that someone like you would even recognize that name. Like, Michigan, we're Michigan girls, right? Yeah. It was small town Michigan. Everybody kind of knew everybody and grew up together. So it's been sort of put together through the timeline that I am one of his first known victims, wow. If not the first. I met Larry and began being abused by Larry at just 8 years old.
8 years old. So you were a gymnast at 8 years old? Is that why you were treating with him?
Yes. And he was not yet a physician. He had not yet been accepted to medical school. He was an athletic trainer volunteering for free at our gymnastics club. And he, found his way into a back room where he set up an old chiropractic table and started, quote unquote, treating, but what we know now was abusing children for the better part of 30 years. And so that is how I have arrived here, where I am representing survivors and taking on the people and the entities who failed the children.
If I recall, I heard you share your story that I had assumed you'd gone to law school to specifically advocate in this way. But if I'm not mistaken, you actually decided to go to law school before you even truly recognized that you had been a victim.
That's absolutely right. I went to law school in my early 20s and, living my life, went to law school. Then I went and got an MBA, and I was working and, just trying to get through life and grow up and become an adult. And my life took a real decline, and I was depressed and anxious and unable to live up to all of these degrees that I had. And my body started attacking itself. It turned out to be stage 4 endometriosis. And I became somewhat of a recluse, and I could not put my finger on why or what was wrong. And I was in therapy and trying all these things. And I just started really, really withdrawing from life. And flash forward, multiple pelvic surgeries, multiple, loss of most of my ovaries, still not putting any connection together. And 36 years old, my teammate from childhood sends me a text message, and it's an article in the Indianapolis Star that says Larry Nassar, Team USA gymnastics doctor accused of abuse. And I didn't even need to open it.
Really?
I did open it.
What was your thought when you read it?
I knew. And there were things in my adult life psychologically, like going back to the 2012 Olympic trials and seeing Larry down there on the floor treating the girls, where I even joked with a teammate of mine, they're still letting him around kids, but we didn't identify it. We identified some of that behavior as weird as adults, but we still loved him. We still loved him. He was our friend, our loved one. But I think deep down psychologically, we knew that something was off, but we did not articulate that or even bring that to our conscious minds necessarily until it all came tumbling out.
I want to be very careful in the way I ask these questions, because there is no way to predict how you're going to react to abuse, how you're going to process it, how you're going to remember it even. So please know that the questions I'm asking you are in no way accusational or judgmental, but I know that there's someone listening who is like, well, if you were treating with him for all those years, did you not at some point think to yourself, oh, that was sexual abuse?
Yeah, I love that question. And thank you for asking it, because it is one of those things that I think I can bring into some clarity for your listeners, because it could be happening to their kids right now.
Yes.
So I was 8 when it began, and the
Mm-hmm.
culture in the gym was highly abusive. Our coach, who was the gold medal winning team coach of the Fierce Five at the 2012 Olympics, John Geddert, he took his own life last year after being charged with 24 counts of child abuse.
Wow.
He was physically and emotionally abusive. And
scary dude.
Oh, scariest. And we'd get sent back to the old treatment room, and there was kind, loving, funny Larry, who in a way was our safe haven. He snuck us food. He was kind to us. When you're 8, like I have a 6-year-old daughter, she doesn't know anything about anything, right? When you're 8, what adults tell you is normal becomes normal. What her teacher tells her is normal behavior at school, she thinks is normal.
That's right.
And so when there are no other adults in the room purposefully, because the parents are very separated from the children, and your kid's going to make it to the Olympics if you stay out of the gym and let her focus. It was all I ever knew. And it was not like, hey, little girl, take down your pants, I'm going to do this. It was chiropractic, doctor of osteopathic, I'm going to release this hip and do this and do this. And so there was probably likely very valid medical treatment wrapped into and now I'm going to do this, which is blatant sexual abuse. And so the mind of a child, it was very, very confusing. And as I grew into adulthood, it would have blown up the entire paradigm of what I thought I knew about my life to say, was that sexual abuse? Was that love? Was that medical treatment? And so you just leave it alone and you bury it and you try to muscle through. And that's why I think the average age of reporting child sex abuse is 52.
52?
52 years old.
That makes you wonder how many people, when they hit 52 and they're like, I'm not going to disrupt my life. I'm not going to cause pain to the people around me. I've got adult children now, the person who my perpetrator's dead. So this goes with me to the grave.
It was so long ago. And I can't tell you how many people in their 50s will call me up and say, finally, my life hasn't worked out the way I wanted. I've had a substance abuse problem. I've always struggled. I've had a hard time, with intimacy or emotional relationships or health issues. Or they call me up and say, something happened and I know it was off, but I was 12 and I couldn't identify it then. And I'm still kind of confused, but I was alone in a room with my coach and they asked me to do this, or my teacher, right? Those kind of fuzzy, I was a kid then, so I'm not sure it was wrong. And now I'm an adult and I have more perspective, but I still am unsure, but I've never forgotten it. And I can still tell you what that locker room smelled like, right? So 52 years old. Wow. 52 years old.
I want to get back to your story, but I also, something popped in my head that I wanted to ask you about, and maybe you've got some information about this, but you said you had stage 4 endometriosis. And I have heard from so many survivors of sexual abuse that autoimmune diseases And, these things are very difficult sometimes to diagnose. And even endometriosis, the incidence of that is much higher in survivors. Is that true?
It's absolutely true. I also was diagnosed with Graves' disease, which is a thyroid autoimmune that they say is hereditary, and nobody in my family's ever had that. Autoimmune, absolutely. It is the body's stress response, right? And it makes perfect sense when you experience trauma and you've either acknowledged it, or especially if you've buried it deep, deep down in the psyche, the body keeps the score. And
Yes.
it sounds cliche, but it's so true. And after I sought out the best endometriosis surgeon in the country, Dr. Ken Sinervo in Atlanta, I had to travel. I came out of my surgery. I was 33. Larry Nassar was not a household name. I wake up and he said, my God, that is one of the worst cases. All I do is endosurgery all day, every day for my entire career. That's one of the worst, craziest cases I've ever seen. You're going to have massive fertility problems. I had to take most of your ovaries. You may never be a mother. Can I ask you something? Have you ever been sexually abused? And it's also a question on his intake form. And I said, no, I don't know what you're talking about.
Sarah, were you denying it to him, to yourself, or both?
Myself. I hadn't acknowledged it. It was not, if you would have said to me at that age, Larry Nassar loved you and was a positive figure in your life, and what he was doing was to release this ligament, to release this bone, to make you compete better, I would have believed you. And that is grooming. I'm not an idiot. I'm an Ivy League educated lawyer, right? I was an adult at that point. At 36, when it all came out, I was a mother. I do think giving birth and having kids also puts it in perspective, though,
yes,
of what would I be okay with my daughter's doctor doing to her. But no, and that's why I have to keep putting it out there. I'd love to be able to say, oh yeah, I totally knew, I was just lying to get out of it. That's the easier answer and makes me look, like I was more hip to it. But I want to make it very clear that if I could be fooled, if I didn't get it, if I didn't feel red flags, if I didn't feel endangered by this kind, loving man whose wedding I attended, then it can happen to anyone in any community. And I guarantee you, from the work that I do, I can promise you that it is.
I recently talked about how this case of Wade Robson and Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
And how his case was just recently dismissed. And it was one of the most incriminating, apparently, pieces of evidence that they had against Wade is that in an earlier trial against Michael Jackson, he testified on behalf of Michael Jackson that he had never been abused by him, that he was kind and loving and caring and all those things. And then once he had his own child, it really hit differently. I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the documentary, he said that when he did testify, he kind of knew he was consciously lying to himself, but at this point, he didn't want to be accused of being a homosexual. He didn't want to be accused of, using this man to get ahead. He was married. He just didn't want all of that attention and stigma. And also in his own mind, he was like, it didn't happen. But then when he, did come to grips with the truth, he was ostracized for having tried to protect himself. And that's just disheartening.
Yeah. And I can't speak on details of that case, given that our firm represents those brave, incredible men, but I did get to go.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I did get to go to the Oprah after show special when that documentary aired originally on HBO. And I have to say, their stories resonate so closely to my own, and that what they experienced and what we experienced when we came forward is something all too common, which is you literally get dragged through the mud, you get called names and liars and get death threats and all sorts of things. And that to me, it doesn't affect me so much anymore. But when you think about the fact that you're doing the most vulnerable thing you're ever going to have to do in your life, which is, talk about the most troubling, painful things in your life, and then you're met with pure, vile hatred, that does a real number on you. And it makes perfect sense as to why people have really sort of statistically not been coming forward all of these decades. And we weren't even having these Me Too conversations, right?
Yeah.
For decades. So that on top of it, there was no role model, in terms of how to navigate coming forward publicly or putting your name on something. And so it's been a real lose-lose for survivors who want to actually share their stories and hold their perpetrator to account.
Sarah, why is it that the cases that we're aware of are these cases where there's a lot of victims? I mean, we don't hear about cases where it's one person. And, in this case, it was Wade and, a few others that appeared in the documentary, but there were countless other victims before that. In your case, I mean, how many victims were there in total, are they estimating, by Larry Nassar?
We know of over 500 at this point, but I'm sure he did this for over 30 years. And why are the numbers high? Yeah. Pedophiles especially, but perpetrators at all demographics get really, really good at it. Perpetrators are almost never that guy in a dark cape in a dark alley, raping you. They're often the good guy. They're often the wolf in sheep's clothing, the teachers, the coaches, the movie producers, the people around kids, the clergy. They have access to victims, and
you don't hear people describing them in retrospect as this monstrous figure. You hear words like, "Oh, he was a saint." He was a miracle worker. I've heard Larry Nassar, like those kinds of phrases they're almost biblical. They're almost spiritual. Like, oh, he's like a god.
Yes. And you think of Harvey Weinstein and Woody Allen and Michael Jackson, right? What do they all have in common? They were God, and Larry Nassar, they were gods in their own world, whatever that world was. And in the case of Nassar, he wasn't actually famous. He wasn't a household name, right? Like a Michael Jackson, but he was famous in his little world. He was running for the school board in Hazlet, or, wherever he lived, Michigan, Mason, Michigan, right? Like he was a god even just in his own little community in Michigan. And that's often the case. They are the pillar of the community. They go to church, they're on the school board, they're the ones volunteering, saving the children, helping the homeless, because it's master manipulation. People buy what you're selling, hook, line, and sinker. And so they will hand their child over to you and say, you trusted doctor, you trusted, music, God, take my child and help them become the best version of themselves. And that is what is so scary about perpetrators and pedophiles, especially.
I can't help but wonder though, if not only is it, the access that these individuals have because they get really good at it, but I also can't help but wonder if one of the reasons why we know about these cases is because there are numbers. Two things happen. It's probably easier to get legal representation. It's probably easier for that legal representation to present a case when there's countless victims whose stories match up. And also it's easier for victims. Like you said, there's probably more than 500 victims of Larry Nassar's, but how many had the courage and the strength and the ability to come forward?
A few.
Wow.
A few. And it takes that few to come forward that creates that domino effect. But don't get me wrong, it is so much easier to stand on the shoulders of those who come before than to be that first domino that starts the whole thing off. That's the one, that pointy end of the spear, that is very rare. And if you are a child being abused by a family member or being abused by a neighbor, you might be the only one, or at least the only one that you know of, or an adult being abused, by a doctor or whatever. How do you know that you're not the only one? And so that's where I see people suffering in silence, being unwilling to take on the regime, unable to have the fortitude, because it's a lot. And I give you so much credit for being that pointy end of the spear. It's a lot. And as you've seen, it's a lot to be that one that says, I'm going to do it. Whatever the consequences, I'm going to tell the truth.
Maybe you can give me some advice.
Yeah.
Because I am working on being an empathetic person. I want to understand.
Yeah.
My first reaction is sometimes one that lacks empathy, when I will talk to, a victim will call me and they'll tell me their story, and it's horrific. And it's like sometimes one of the worst ones. And they want to give me all these details and pour it out. And they talk about how wrong it is. And they will thank me for, giving them the courage to tell their story. And then they'll finish by saying, but I need to stay anonymous. I will not file a police report. I will not file a claim with the medical board. And I don't want to be part of any litigation. I just wanted you to hear this. And I want to be sympathetic, but it also makes me so angry. It takes everything in me not to say, do you understand how important your story is? I want to encourage them to take back their power, but I also know, because I've got a friend who's a therapist, that's not my place.
Yeah.
So what advice do you have for me?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've learned, because I've seen everybody on every sort of part of that spectrum, is healing is such a journey, and it's not a straight line. And it is the first question we ask ourselves, unfortunately, because we've been conditioned this way by society, is when we are harmed, when we are victimized, the first go-to is, what does that mean about me? What does that mean about me? And to acknowledge that publicly, or to take any action, is going to mean something about you, and your identity, the way you have seen yourself, is going to shift, and the way other people around you see you is going to shift. Some are going to be very positive and some are going to be very negative, but it will shift. What do we know? People don't like change. People don't like change, and it's easier to stay in fear and shame and swim around in that than it is to even necessarily see that there could be another side. We have been conditioned not to talk about sex. We have been conditioned, especially, not to talk about things relating to sex that might be violent, that might be ugly, that might be horrible. Who wants to sit around and picture an adult having sex with a child, or a doctor taking advantage of a patient, right? We don't want to think about it. And so psychologically, it can be easier to go about our merry way. What I can say is, if that person is not dealing with this therapeutically, somehow, some way, it will come back to bite them in the ass. Their body will fail. Their relationships will fail. They will have manifestations of harboring trauma within the psyche and within the body that will rear their ugly heads. Unfortunately, I've never seen anybody be able to stuff it away successfully forever. But when you
say it's easier, it's the belief is that it's easier, but it's like trying to push this overinflated beach ball beneath the surface of the water. And you can only hold it down for so long before it shoots up at the most inopportune time.
Beautiful analogy. Exactly right. But for those that just don't want to get involved, but are dealing with it therapeutically,
Yeah.
that might just be their coping mechanism is not to go to battle. Their coping mechanism is to, handle that internally in their own
Hmm.
way. And that I'm like you, I'm on the front lines. I want to shout it from the rooftop, but to swallow that not everybody is wired like that can be a tough pill to swallow, especially when you're trying to effect change to save others' lives
Yeah.
eventually.
I just want there to be consequences. And,
Yep.
as a lawyer, and you practice in multiple states,
Yep.
the laws are not, I mean, maybe I'm biased, but it certainly seems like the laws are really set up to protect perpetrators.
100%. And part of that is that they're just old, they're archaic,
Mm.
they haven't been dealt with in the era of, yes, we talk about these things because yes, these things happen. And in other respects, I think laws are designed to protect money, brand, reputation, entities. And how are laws changed? Laws are changed through lobbying. Those who hold office, state office, or otherwise, federal office, or US senators, so on and so forth. But how do people become elected if they're not appointed?
Right.
It's money. It's money. Surprise. All roads lead back to money. And so, laws in Pennsylvania in terms of statutes of limitations aren't changing. Why? Because the Catholic Church is funding millions of dollars worth of lobbying in order to, keep these bills from being passed so they don't go bankrupt or they don't face liability. Note to every entity, potential defendant ever listening, it will cost you less to do the right thing than it will to not. It would cost less for these statutes to protect children, protect people from predators than it would for the church who harbored predators and who were on notice about these predators to settle civil lawsuits, right?
For those who aren't maybe familiar with legal terminology,
Yes.
let's talk about statute of limitations. So can
Yeah.
you speak a little bit about what is a statute of limitations and what are they as they pertain to victims of sexual abuse? And I'm sure it varies by state.
Absolutely. So the statute of limitations is essentially the window in which a victim of a crime has to report it or file a lawsuit, have access to the courts.
Okay.
There are different statutes for the criminal system and different statutes for the civil system. And you are exactly right. They vary vastly state by state. As you can imagine, it's all tied up in politics and it's all tied up in, sort of which way the Senate and the House swing in that particular state in a particular year. So it's very, very political. We have seen in the last few years, especially, a trend towards better law. I've been personally on the front lines. I've testified in multiple states at this point. We got this great window legislation passed in New York where adult survivors of child sex abuse all of a sudden had a free pass for 2 years. At age 75, you could file a case for what happened to you when you were 5, right?
What do you mean? What do you mean? Wait a second. What do you mean? You had to wait till you were 75 years old?
No, I'm saying that person whose statute ran way, way long ago got this great revival window in which they could file a suit. California is amidst a 3-year window. So if you were sexually abused as a child in the state of California, you can file a civil lawsuit. You have access to the courts for a limited period of time to file a case where you are not subject to the statute of limitations, which is brilliant.
Can you walk me through an example? Because I'm kind of lost.
So
let's say I was I'm a victim who was sexually molested at age, whatever, 8, 9. And I don't come to grips with this, even admit it to myself fully understand it until I'm in therapy and I'm 39 years old.
Yes.
What can I do?
Yes. So in particular states, you may have access to the courts for a limited window. So for example, in New York, you're out of luck because that window closed. It was a 2-year, one and done. File all your suits now.
2 years from the time of what?
No, 2 years just arbitrarily.
Just like, surprise, everybody. We're
Surprise.
lifting
It
the
was
statute for
enacted
2 years.
It was
Quick.
enacted in 2019, and it was supposed to be a 1-year window, and then it got extended because of COVID and was a 2-year window. So that is something we're trying to get in every state so that adult survivors of child sex abuse have access to the courts. But wouldn't it be better if just every state said no statute of limitations backwards or forwards, because that protects perpetrators? I mean, you still have to go through the judicial system and prove your case, right? Like, it's not a free pass to finding somebody guilty, but it's just getting your foot in the door. That's what I'm talking about, getting your foot in the door. And in many, many states, our laws do not even allow you to get your foot in the door. An excellent resource for this is childusa.org. It's a wonderful nonprofit that I work with. And if you click on law, you can literally look at a map of the United States and click on every single state, and you can see what the current statutes are. And you can learn about that window legislation to see if perhaps your state is amidst a window where you'd need to take recourse immediately, or if we have something on the horizon in terms of that. But it's mind-blowing. I'll give you a great example. We have a case, a pediatrician pedophile case in the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has horrible law, very Catholic state. We've been pounding the pavement for years. This pediatrician pled guilty. He's in prison for the rest of his life. In terms of the civil case, if you were under 30 years old when we filed the case, you had recourse. If you were 31, you did not. Same perpetrator, same doctor, same sexual abuse, but the law cut you off at 30 years old. That's the statute of limitations.
That makes no sense. When you say this pediatrician pled guilty, can you share his name?
Yes, Dr. Jack Bartow it's a pediatrician pedophile case, and in his criminal case, he pled guilty.
And did he plead guilty to a number of counts, a number of incidences?
Correct.
Okay. How many known victims are there?
We are ongoing in litigation in the civil case, so I cannot comment on that, though I will say there are multiple victims.
And this is a pediatrician.
Correct.
A person who you assume loves children for the right reasons, wants to treat and help children, who's taken an oath to do no harm to children, and he's harming children. He's destroying children.
45 years in practice.
Wow.
Pled guilty.
Another case that I know, and maybe you can't speak to this, so I certainly understand that, but there was a gynecologist at USC, Dr. Tyndall. Tyndall, that's right, Dr. Tyndall. Tell me a little bit, or what you can, about that particular case.
Yeah, so he was your health services gynecologist, right? A lot of times you get to college and it's the first time you're even seeing a gynecologist.
Yep.
For the most part, most of us, right?
Yeah.
And because up until then, we've been seeing our pediatrician for the most part. And so we get to college, we make an appointment, and maybe we go to health services and we say, we'd like to explore birth control, or I, would like to have my first pap smear, which we know is really important and critical. Or I'm having this pain or whatever. I'm having pelvic pain from my endometriosis. I'd like to see the gynecologist. You would be seeing Dr. George Tyndall, who was the university gynecologist, who we know now was using his position of authority at the university to sexually abuse hundreds upon thousands of young women at the university under the guise, once again, of medical treatment. We were in litigation on that case for several years. The case recently settled last year, the end of last year, for close to $1 billion.
With a B?
With a B. With a B.
It makes me happy.
Yeah. And what people need to know about civil cases, you mentioned it with the Jackson case. It's just about money. These women, they just want money, right? You can't put a university in prison. Last time I checked, you can't pick up the University of Southern California and put them behind bars. You also cannot begin to calculate the damages of sexual trauma, of that kind of a breach in trust psychologically, the physical manifestations of sexual trauma will have on your life. You are not 99 years old on your deathbed right now. So for example, I'm almost 43 years old.
Looking good, girl.
Thanks, girl. If I calculated the damages just of Nassar, IVF, pelvic surgeries, out of pocket, therapy for the forever, right? You know, all of the loss of earnings, not being able to come out of my house for 7 years, right? You can't put a price on taking away somebody's ovaries. How much did my ovaries cost? Somebody want to wager to put a money amount on that? I don't think you can. And I've had to pay and pay and pay and pay for what I now know to be the repercussions of 17 years of penetration, starting as a child. So civil cases are not about money. It's about money in that sense.
It's about
right?
consequences.
It's also about who knew what when. Criminal case ends, guilty or innocent. That's the only thing a criminal case is addressing. Did that person do the act or not against this person or this person or this person? Oftentimes, not all cases. In Nassar, I think there were 9 charged cases in the criminal case, not 500, 9.
9?
But what the civil process does is it tells you who knew what when. When was it reported? Why didn't they do anything? We see criminal charges.
We pull in all the culpable parties.
All the culpable parties. More criminal charges brought against other people who look the other way. You will not get answers to your story oftentimes in these bigger cases without a civil case. My very last thing I addressed recently, all California police chiefs in the state of California and all women in law enforcement in the state of California at 2 different events. The number, and you're going to know a lot about this, the number of criminal cases that are passed on is like in the 98th, 96th percentile. Either they just don't have enough evidence, or it's going to be a he said, she said, and they don't want to put the victim through a trial. If they don't think they can actually achieve some justice, oftentimes they are not permitted to even charge the case. So what happens? What happens to those cases? Sometimes, not always, there is civil recourse and you can do something civilly. The Nassar civil charges were filed before the Nassar criminal charges were filed.
That's interesting.
People don't know. One domino can affect the other and vice versa. It's not
gives me
always,
some hope.
Yes.
Because these are crimes that are more often than not, unwitnessed.
Yep.
Enshrouded in shame. Yep. And they're often crimes where it is someone of lesser authority, lesser stature, lesser financial means, making an accusation against a beloved, prestigious, white coat wearing, well-respected member of the community. And so, it's in all of us to have this cognitive dissonance that people of authority that we trust don't do these things. Like this goes against our, everything that we believe to be true and safe in the world. So even people who are very credible, when you come forward and have these things to say and to say that this happened, people doubt you and they question you.
Yep. Yeah. And add on top of that, being a child, or add on top of
Oh,
that, it being your uncle or your dad, or, everybody's favorite teacher, there are a lot of layers. We are taught to be rule followers, not to be disruptors. And I think it's about time we really look at how we're raising our kids. But it's easier to go along with it than it is to go against the grain. And so that's why I love people like you, people like me. You don't have to be out there publicly pounding the pavement. There are things people can do to be disruptors anonymously, right? It doesn't take a name to call up your state legislator and say, I demand that those laws be changed.
I recently had a guest on the show talking about medical fertility fraud, and we created an Instagram reel together to bring attention to some legislation that she's trying to make sure people know about in terms of their fertility rights in a variety of states. And just the sheer number of people who shared that reel has made a dramatic difference in getting that legislation back on state floors.
Yep.
And, she's like, it's just remarkable. And so I just want everyone to know that what you just said, Sarah, is so profound and true. We're not asking everyone to, go down to their local state capitol and march in front of it with a sign. Sometimes it's just as much as sharing this podcast, sharing an Instagram post, sharing a petition, and so that we educate ourselves. We have to advocate for ourselves. We have to take care of each other, because otherwise politicians, dirty money are at the core of this. Speaking of dirty money, the case that your firm was involved with, the USC OBGYN, I have heard, and I'm sure it's just an assumption or allegation, probably an assumption, that because of that case in particular, that many of the insurance companies that insure doctors have changed policies to limit policies where there is some form of sexual misconduct, so that the payout is so low on those cases that attorneys are less likely to take a case where a doctor has sexually assaulted, sexually abused, or raped a patient.
That makes me sick. I haven't heard that. But
would it surprise you?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Where there's money involved, nothing surprises me anymore, unfortunately. I love what you said about just the idea of rights. I want to throw this in there. If you ask an average American citizen to recite their Miranda rights, they're all going to be able to do it, right? They're going to be able to quote Law and Order and say, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. What you say can and will be used. We can all say that, right? Yeah. We all know that. We've all seen that TV show. Those rights are for somebody being charged with a crime or in custody, right? That is the person. Those are for rights of somebody being in custody with law enforcement. If you said to the average person, what are your fertility rights? What are your crime victims' rights? There's a whole list of rights that crime victims have in terms of their process. You talk a lot about what are the rights of a patient, right? What are patient rights? Why don't we know those things? Why aren't we talking about those things? Why do we all know the rights of the person, being questioned or interrogated or in custody with law enforcement, instead of understanding our rights as a patient, as a victim? And why aren't we teaching those things more often? It goes back to that everything has been so skewed pro perpetrator and not pro victim, and that's what's got to change.
Oh my gosh, big work ahead of us. Yes, I want to speak specifically to that person who might be listening, who either they have a family member or friend who they know was a victim, or they themselves were, and they're like, I'm just so overwhelmed hearing this right now. I feel sick to my stomach. I don't even know where to go, what to start, or if I should do anything. Any advice on where to start?
Yeah, that's an average response. First of all, you are normal for having that response. This is heavy duty stuff. And I have been in those shoes and walked in those shoes. And so for that person listening, I see you and I hear you and I feel you and I believe you. And if nobody's ever said that to you before, let me be the first. I believe you, and you should have lived a life without trauma, period. We all have that right. We deserved that. And so for anybody listening, you deserved a life without this, and there can be healing on the other side of this, I promise. But there are steps you can take. There's beautiful online communities of survivors, our paths crossed. And I respond to as many people as possible. There are support groups, there are podcasts, there are, just so many of us that are ready and willing to envelop you. There is no statute of limitations on filing a police report. It can be a very empowering thing to do. A lot of times when my clients call me and maybe they don't have a great statute, and this happened a long time ago, the simple act of walking into the police station and filing that report, just to file the report, even if nothing can be done, can be very, very empowering. And that can be recourse. And then also, criminal statutes of limitations, civil recourse, it's worth looking into. If you think that person is out there, if you think that person could be hurting somebody else, I would consider turning the tables, taking your power back, and putting them in the position of having to defend themselves, because chances are they've been getting away with this for too long. Where there is one victim, there are often many. And so keep that in mind. And every voice counts, every voice matters. And a story and a passion for change can change the freaking world. And so you don't have to be famous rock star with an amazing Instagram following. A story and a passion for making sure that not one more person is hurt can be enough to take that first baby step. And when you are ready, we are here, arms wide open, and we are on the right side of history, because there is a right side of history when it comes to abuse in any form. And so to whoever's listening, I love you and I believe you.
Sarah, Sarah Klein, you are a fierce, powerful advocate. And I am so happy that you have the strength and courage to use your pain to help others in this way, and not just help others, but like restore the power balance. I freaking love it. I mean, someone like you just makes me so happy. I mean, the moment I met you, I'm like, yes, like, this is who I want to be aligned with. We need more women and men. We just need more victims to know that it's their power to take back. It was theirs all along. Someone robbed them of it. And you need to go back and take it into your own hands, whether that's by you taking care of yourself or taking further action or taking steps to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else.
Yes, that is absolutely it. I love it. And I look bright and shiny at 43, but I lived many, many decades in the shadows. And so if I can do it, barely getting by, crawling along, anybody can do it. And we are all here to support all survivors in this family that we never asked to be a part of, but we find ourselves in, to make the world a little bit safer.
You've got a great podcast. It's called Bar Fight. Love the name.
Yeah.
Seen on a bunch of documentaries lately. I mean, you just, I love it. And is there any place else that you're pretty active that people can reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at Sarah, SARAHG Klein. I am all over Google, all over. I got a TED Talk. I've got, all sorts of stuff out there.
And we'll have links to all of that in our show notes.
Awesome.
So you guys don't even have to write it down. Sarah, thank you so much for being a guest today. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, my sweet friend. We will do this together.
Yes, I love it.